So, Alvin, tell us a little bit about your background and where you grew up.
Certainly. I was born and raised in Palm Beach County, Florida, in the city of West Palm Beach, in a neighborhood called Pleasant City, which is perhaps the most economically challenged part of West Palm Beach and is the historic sort of center of the African American community in Palm Beach County. I grew up on the corner of Palm Beach Lakes and Tamarind Avenue, which if you asked most people about Palm Beach Lakes and Tamarind Avenue, the first word out of their mouth would probably be run,
Oh boy.
because it is rife with economic despair, crime, and violence. But in the midst of it all, there were people who were just like me, who have gone on to do some pretty amazing things with their lives.
Awesome. And so coming from that background, tell us a little bit about who your mentors are, because I know they had a lot to do with your upbringing.
Absolutely. And in fact, when people ask me how I've been able to achieve any modicum of success, I often tell them that I attribute much of that success to my mentors. And so I had mentors like a woman by the name of Maud Ford Lee. And Maud Ford Lee was the first African-American elected to the Palm Beach County Commission, which is the highest governing body in my neck of the woods. And she saw something in me at 16 years old and hired me as an intern. And I walked through life for the next 27 years with her, and had the honor of actually eulogizing her about a year or so ago, in, sort of commemorating a memorable life. And then another mentor of mine is a gentleman by the name of Alcee Hastings, who actually wrote the foreword for my book. He's been a member of Congress since 1992, and is Florida's longest serving member of Congress. And he has just been such a real influence in my life.
Why did you want to write this book? Because I know this book is long overdue. And I understand that your book is kind of themed by the book The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. So tell us a little bit about why you wanted to infuse that theme into your book, and how important that is for the African-American male in the community.
Wow. Well, what inspired the book was the untimely deaths of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. And I found myself cussing at the TV, as I often do, in saying, why doesn't someone say something? Why doesn't somebody do something? Someone needs to illustrate how the challenges of being a Black man in America, how deep it is and how far that rabbit hole goes. And I soon began to realize that someone was me. And so I started a process that was about 5 years in the making. And I was always a fan of Ralph Ellison. Ralph Ellison was the first African-American to win the National Book Award, of which I have been nominated for, and my fingers are crossed. But Ellison's work on Invisible Man really left an indelible impression on me as a young high school student. It helped to crystallize to me that even back in the 1940s, when Ellison wrote that book, the challenges of being seen and not seen, the challenges of being there but nobody recognizes your humanity, were real and present in 21st century America, just as real as they were in 20th century America. And so that was how I sort of was able to infuse Ellison's work in the book. Interestingly enough, the book, every single chapter starts out with a quote from Invisible Man. And it sort of crystallizes everything we're going to be talking about in that chapter. And to give you some context, Still Invisible is a 550-page tome on what it means to be a Black man in America. And I did not set out or intend to write a 550-page book, but it's sort of a long story. And I was able to crystallize it by taking what Ellison wrote back in the 1940s and fast forwarding it to 2020 and what it means in 15 areas of life for African American men. And so we started out with Black boys as boys in the education system. And we talked about issues of stereotypes in a chapter we have called Don't They All Look Alike? We talked about the relationship with the police, the relationship with the criminal justice system, what it means to be young, Black, gifted, and ultimately unemployed. And we talked about the challenges that Black men face in health, in mental health and physical health, and all of those different areas of life and what it means today in terms of how it impacts African American men in a real and meaningful and significant way. And what we can't get past is the fact that racism is still alive and well here in these United States of America.
Well, it's interesting about what you said about how it took you 5 years to kind of develop this book, because I noticed that for Ralph Ellison, it took him 5 years to write his book also. So I thought there was a lot of similarities between you.
I did not know that.
I thought, yeah, because I thought I read that it took him about 5 years. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it was about 5 years.
And it took me 5 years because I kept picking it up and putting it down, and picking it up and putting it down. And the book is not just a book on the challenges of what it means to be Black, but I interviewed 15 African-American men from all walks of life. I interviewed the lawyers for the family of Trayvon Martin. I interviewed African-American physicians and psychologists. I interviewed a brother who is a correspondent for BET at the White House. I interviewed a brother who was in prison because I wanted to get the totality of all of their experiences and to see if there were any commonalities. And so there was the interview perspective of it. There was a lot of research in terms of I wanted to make sure that I got it right, because I realized that it would be parsed and picked apart. And so I have 3 sections at the end of every chapter called, the first part of it is called The Survey Says, where I surveyed 400 people in a polling group that looked like America. And so 60% were white, 12% were African American, 18% were Hispanic, Asian, Middle Eastern, and so forth, because I wanted to find out what are your real views on what you think about Black people. So we have The Survey Says. I have a part called By the Numbers, where we look at the actual facts. So don't take my opinion on this. You know, when we talk about African American men, for example, being fathers for their children, one of the things I found in the research is that Black men, actually, we're more involved in the lives of our children today than any other racial subgroup in America. And see, you don't know that if you don't know the actual statistics. So that's what By the Numbers is about. But the last part of every chapter is called Prescriptions for Progress, where I say, okay, we know the challenges, we know the facts, we know your opinion on the matter, but what can we do right now? What can you, sitting in your home reading this book, what can you do, not next week, not next month, but right now, to help make the lives of African American men better? And so we offer 3 separate prescriptions in every single chapter on how to move the ball forward for making this a more perfect union.
Thank you for that. I also noticed that you start off in the beginning talking about Lady Justice. Can you kind of talk about why you incorporated that into the, like you said, the prescription, what as part of the, not necessarily the solution, but how actually the system works and why Lady Justice is important from her perspective?
That is the only creative portion of the book. Well, let me not say that is the only creative portion of the book. That is the primary creative portion of the book, because it is a non-fiction book that talks about the real lives of real people in a real way. But Lady Justice is this ever-present force in American society that rules with an iron fist in the lives of African-American men in particular. And I didn't think that the story of who we are right now in 21st century America could not be told without Lady Justice. And so she is the narrator in this this entire 550-page book. She opens up every single chapter, and it's sort of like a love letter that she writes to the reader. And she starts off very matter of fact, very, you know, it is what it is. I'm not apologizing for a damn thing. And so in the beginning of the tome, Lady Justice is very harsh, and she softens a bit as time goes on in the book. But it's very clear that she has an opinion. And Justice's opinion on us is just as important in 21st century America as our opinion of ourselves.
Okay. All right, I know you talked about a lot about the process, about going to get the research and data, and the I saw that you had a lot of photos of and reinforcing a lot of the stereotypes of Black men and talking about the Black boys and the data and the statistics. For you, I want to know, I know a lot of these things that you knew already, but for you personally, what was the most shocking statistic that you found when you were doing your research? Because I know there was a lot of things, but you know, sometimes when we're doing research, there's things that jump out at us, and it's like telling us, you know, I need to focus on this part because these are things that people may not know about.
Sure. I think that there are two things that sort of struck out at me as surprising. And I'm glad you brought this up because I have a confession to make. And the confession is that the primary market for the book are not Black men, and it's not Black people. No, it is not. The primary market for the book are white people. White people in general, and probably white women with a progressive sort of bent in particular. But to be clear, this is a book for Black people that can be embraced by Black people. But the point of this whole sort of idea is to get those who do not know the history of African Americans and what we have walked through over the course of the last 400 years, to sort of give them a beginning to now narrative of what it means to be Black. But with that being said, remind me your question again, because I got off on a...
Sorry, it was talking about what things jumped out at you, what statistics,
Yes.
what data jumped out at you that you wouldn't have normally focused on.
So the first thing that jumped out at me was the history of watermelons. Had no idea that watermelon, the reason it has become such a pejorative in mainstream American culture, because the reason it has become so racialized when it comes to Black people and has been used as an insult when referring to Black people, was because at the collapse of slavery, and all of these African Americans now became sort of sharecroppers on plantations. They began to cultivate watermelon. And there were a lot of Black people who started getting rich selling watermelon. And watermelon became sort of this symbol of liberation for newly freed slaves. And so as a means of sort of putting these Black people back in their place, we're going to make watermelon a dreaded thing. And we're going to insist that if you are white and you're eating watermelon, well, then you're no better than those Black people over there doing it. And so the demonization of that fruit for the sole purpose of making sure that African Americans couldn't reach economic sort of independence really struck me as how devious the mind can be. So that was the first thing that jumped out at me. And I think the second thing that really jumped out at me is just looking at the raw numbers in my chapter on the prison industrial complex. I have a chapter called "Where is the Love? Is there no sort of forgiveness for Black men who go to prison and come out?" and they paid their dues to society. But when you look at how it started, and this isn't anything that's new, but seeing it actually, so every picture, every graph, every infographic in the book, I created myself. I developed myself, I designed myself, I drafted myself. And as I designed the infographic for the chapter on the prison industrial complex, and I inputted the numbers from Richard Nixon to Donald Trump in terms of how African-American men were sentenced to prison, to see that precipitous jump in the Clinton administration. I mean, it was really sort of loud and drastic. And you know, I'm a guy who I you know, as a young college student and as a high school student in the early 1990s, Bill Clinton was the thing, man. You know, he was the one that really sort of represented what it meant to have a president that had an administration that, quote unquote, looked like America. But when you looked at those numbers, they locked up a lot of Black people. And it was more than anyone else. It was during President Clinton's administration, and it was sort of shocking to me.
That's interesting that you say that. Now, did you meet Clinton? Because I know
many
because I know that I kind of followed you, and you had said that you have met several presidents. So that's another question.
Carter.
4, 3, 4.
Yes. I've been to the Ford Presidential Library, but I did have the privilege of meeting George W. In fact, interestingly enough, after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, I was serving as chief of staff for the National Urban League on Wall Street in New York City. And the president of the Urban League at the time, and the president who is still the president, Mark H. Morial, was the former mayor of the city of New Orleans. And so when New Orleans was devastated by Katrina, it was a week or so before I was to get married. But we hopped on a plane and went down to Houston, where a lot of the Katrina evacuees had been taken. And we were there at the George R. Brown Convention Center that had been turned into sort of an evacuee location. And I'm there with then Senator Barack Obama, Rick Perry, the then governor of Texas, also George H.W. Bush, his wife, Barbara Bush, Bill Clinton, me, Mark Morial, and Oprah Winfrey, and Dick Gregory. And we're walking through the convention center together. So I have many sort of memories of working with a number of presidents in the work I did at the National Urban League.
Okay. And did any one of those presidents kind of have anything that kind of had an impact on you that you used to kind of move forward? Anything that they've said to you that kind of stood out?
Yes. Yes. George W. Bush, 2004, National Urban League Convention. George Bush was running at this time for re-election against John Kerry. And he was speaking at the convention, and I was on the front row, and I'm seated between Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. And I'm seated there, and President Bush is speaking, and he's looking at me. And he's speaking, and he's looking at me. And I'm thinking to myself, he can't be looking at me. Nah, he's not looking at me. And for like 45 minutes, he's speaking, and he's eyeball to eyeball with me. And I'm thinking, wow, this is wild. He finishes his speech, does a beeline from the podium straight to me. And I'm thinking, he can't be walking over here towards me. And he walks to me, and he puts his arm around my shoulder. And I've got a wonderful picture in my home. And he whispers in my ear, he said, I watched you 45 minutes, and I got to tell you, you've got kind eyes. And I laughed, and I said, well, I've got a wife, Mr. President, but thank you very much. And he sort of cracked up laughing. But I found him to be a very warm and engaging individual, despite the politics. And I disagreed with him probably on most stuff. Mm-hmm. But just from a personal perspective, I found him to be very kind and warm.
That's a great story. I know that there was a lot of things that you covered in your book. Maybe you can talk about, because we're doing this for the Chicago Defender, maybe you want to talk about the things that maybe is like in Chicago, we just have had federal troops come in, the National Guard, for certain purposes. Maybe you
Yeah.
want to talk about what you think, how that affects minorities and the Black man in particular, how Black families are going to be affected by this this movement, this event that of kind of occupying Chicago and other cities like this.
Well, let me just say that none of this is by accident. We are, and the administration has sort of telegraphed its moves from the beginning, and so you got to give them that. At least they're up front with it. You know, I'm from the South, and I say all the time that I appreciate what I like to call the good old boys down here, because they tell you how they feel. And so, you know, it's like the guy who picked up a snake and the snake bites him many years later after he, you know, brings him back to health. And the snake says, you knew what I was when you picked me up. And so this does not surprise me, but let me just say this. Using crime as a ruse to invade majority African-American cities or Black run cities or Democratic run cities or any kind of run cities is antithetical to what we would call a democratic society. But let's be clear, like Langston Hughes said many years ago, America ain't never really been America to me. And so having an occupying force in a Black city or a Black neighborhood is nothing new to us. We can overcome this, but it is important for us to not lose hope, to not lose our voice, to stand up for what's right, to keep fighting the good fight of faith, to understand that if they do it in Chicago, they're going to do it in Detroit, and they're going to do it in Omaha, and they're going to do it all across this country. And I think that it is a harbinger of things to come if we don't stand up right now and say something and do something about this horrible threat to society as we know it.
I definitely agree. What okay, so that's one issue. The other issue is the pandemic that has begun in 2020. We already have this disparity of healthcare. Talk a little bit about that, because I know you did talk about that in the book, about how it's taken a toll on people of color and the stress already that we have kind of inherited from slavery already, and then the pandemic is on top of that. Talk a little bit about that, if you can.
I appreciate you talking about the stress that we have inherited from slavery, because I talk about this idea of post-traumatic slave syndrome and how African Americans are impacted with that. It's ensconced in our DNA. And so there are fears that we have that we may not know why we have a fear of X, Y, Z, because your great, 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 great grandmother had that fear. And so, you know, those sort of things are passed down through generations. One of the things I talk about in the book is the fact that African Americans in general, and African American men in particular, we live quicker and we die, well, we live sicker and die quicker than anybody else. And so when you have all of these instances of hypertension, of high blood disease, of, you know, I think the number one cause for death amongst African-American men is heart disease. And so when you look at that, when you look at all of the other challenges, but there's another challenge that is significant and profound, and I believe it is number 6 or 7, homicide. Homicide is an issue that we have to address in our community. You're talking to a guy who all of my siblings were murdered when I was a student at Hampton University. You know, when I was a junior, I lost my oldest brother who was killed in a drive-by shooting. The following year, my senior year, I lost another brother who was killed in a fight over a girl. And they were killed by Black people. Let's be clear about that. And so we have a problem when it comes to valuing and understanding, you know, the fact that life is precious and you only get one shot at this thing. And we snatch other people's lives as if they have no meaning. And it leaves a terrible burden, a cognitive burden on mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and all of the people who may have been shot and killed in Chicago last week, who have loved ones who have to pick up and walk on it. And at what point do we not say somebody has to do something about this? And so there is a need to address real crime. And let me just say this too. As a person who walked a beat as an auxiliary police officer for the New York Police Department in Harlem, I walked a beat between 125th and 148th Street on Malcolm X Boulevard. And so I will tell you that if it's one thing that Black people appreciate, are police who keep law and order and peace. Black people love peace just like everybody else. We don't want to walk down the street and get knocked upside the head and have our things robbed from us like anybody else. We just want to be able to live in a nation that affords us the opportunity to not be harassed, not be locked up, or worse, simply because we're Black. But when you have all of these issues and you compound racism, systemic racism, which has a significant and material impact on our mental health, on our quality of life, on our physical health, on our longevity. I mean, hell, we can't even walk out the door and get in the car for fear that we might not be pulled over and shot by the police. Those are real issues. And until we start addressing those, we're going to continue to see sort of this disparity, particularly with COVID-19, which is running, is wreaking havoc. I'm in South Florida, and, we're losing people unnecessarily because they're being attacked by a virus that preys on the vulnerable. And who are the vulnerable? Poor people, Black people, brown people, minorities, people who don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, people who don't have access to quality health care. Those are the ones that are impacted the most by this dreaded virus.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a couple more questions and we're going to wrap this up.
Okay.
So, do you think that, I know you talked a lot about, what people need. So I'm going to say, as far as serving the community and your dreams and aspirations, what, some of the things that you've done recently as far as serving the community, how do you think, like, as far as you said West Palm Beach, talk a little bit about some of the things that you've done in your community to try to, bring people together. And then the second part of that is going to be, you have children. What
Yes.
advice would you give to your children, or do you give to your children now moving forward? We have the pandemic, we have the protests and different things. As a father, what do you tell your Black children? And what do you tell other Black children?
May I start with that question first?
Yes.
So what I tell my children, and it is a lesson that I repeat all the time, and it may be very simple, and it may be to the point, but the lesson that I tell them is to learn to keep your mouth closed. Be quiet. Stop talking. Just shut up. And I have found that there's a reason why you have old Black men. And the reason you got old Black men, because they learned early in life to be quiet. Stop talking. Keep your mouth closed. Just shut up. Mm-hmm. And it's not always right. It's often not fair. But in the United States of America, as a Black man, it is what it is. And I need you as my child to come home. And so if you are ever bumped up by the police for whatever reason, stop talking. Be quiet. Hush your mouth, because I need you to just come home. And then we can figure out whatever the issue is, but it starts with keeping your mouth closed. So that's the advice I give my own kids, and I would probably give to anyone's kids. Now, the second part was a two-part question, which is ambition and what are you doing now? So let me tell you what I'm doing now, and maybe I'll touch on ambition. Right now, I serve as chairman of the board of an organization called Palm Beach Harvest Food Bank. We are the largest provider of rescued food to the citizens of South Florida. Since COVID-19, we have put out anywhere from 1.5 million to 3.5 million of pounds of food every single month. As chairman of the board, I insisted that we serve everyone, but we start where the need is greatest. And so we make sure that we start in Florida's poorest city, which is predominantly Black, a city called Belglade, and we fan out from there. We serve every week bulk distribution. I'd probably say 7,000 to 10,000 families, 20 to 30 pounds of fresh fruit and vegetables every single week. In food deserts where they don't get this, where they have never seen fresh zucchini and squash and cucumbers and tomatoes. And so we do that every single week, and I'm proud of that. In terms of my ambition, I've got a book, it's been nominated, the book we're talking about has been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in 2 categories. It's been nominated for the National Book Award and the American Book Award. And so we'll see where that takes me. But I will say this, one of my passions, one of the things I have always wanted to do is to serve some sort of higher purpose for my community. And so I'm going to look at, as the landscape sort of settles down after this coming election, I'm going to look at my opportunities and see where the Lord leads me. Awesome.
So thank you so much, Elvin. Thank you for, sharing with us. And actually, I would love to, follow up with this and we have another conversation, but thank you so much for, talking to us about your book, Still Invisible. And it's so relevant. I mean, I know you wrote it 5 years ago, but
it came out in January.
Right. You started writing it 5 years ago and it just came out in January. But correct. I mean, thank you for your, for just your perseverance and your motivation. And, that's the type of thing that we like to see among our people, and, we look towards people like you as for leadership. I mean, you're very much needed in the community. So we appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Okema. I really appreciate you. And call me anytime. I love The Defender. So whatever y'all need, you call me. I'm your guy.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Awesome.